Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. This is Grant Cameron, and I want to thank you for taking some of your valuable time to join me here today. I have a special guest today from the Netherlands, and his name is Gerard Aartsen, and he's an educator there at the university, I believe, and he's written a whole series of books on ancient wisdom, on Adamski, and his book he's put out last year that we're going to be talking about today is a little bit on consciousness. So I want to welcome Gerald. Welcome to my little broadcast here, and I'm really excited to talk to you. In fact, my other assistant, Desta Barnaby, had said to me, "Oh, you got to get this Gerald guy on. And he's fantastic, whatever." And I said, "Oh, I've got him on already. I got him on tomorrow night." So a lot of people are sort of recommending that I talk to you. And when I watched some of your stuff today, I was pretty impressed that you seem to be on the right track. So maybe give me a little bit of background as how you got into this UFO field, because you're an academic, you got a master's degree, and you're at a university, which I was at a university for 37 years, and I know it's not exactly a place that you talk about UFOs too much, and you never refer to that indicate that maybe the university has anything to do with it. But so tell me how you got started, and again, welcome to, and I appreciate your taking time to talk to me about, you've done how many books? 4 books now?
Five, and 2 websites.
Beautiful. And
well, thanks for having me on, Grant. I'm still active at the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam at the School of Education, and I coach students in their teaching practice there.
Yeah.
But quite apart from that, I've also been a student of what is known as the Ageless Wisdom Teaching for over 40 years now. And the Ageless Wisdom Teaching could be seen as the body of teachings that encompass everything from religion and philosophy and art and science.
Okay.
And they have been handed down through the centuries, for the most part, word to mouth. And since the late 19th century, they have been reintroduced to the public at large through the work of Madame Blavatsky, H.P. Blavatsky, who was much maligned in her days and vilified. But about 100 years after the appearance of a publication of a report that condemned her as a fraud, the same organization, the Society for Psychical Research, withdrew the report and said it was not at all conducted on proper basis. So they said the condemnation of Madame Blavatsky as a fraud was unjustified.
Wow.
After her work, The Secret Doctrine, a seminal work, and ISIS Unveiled, another British, in this case, a British disciple, Alice A. Bailey, elaborated a lot on Blavatsky's work from 1919 to 1949. And there have been other installments of the Ageless Wisdom Teaching, most recently from the British artist and esotericist Benjamin Graham. And I've been involved with his work for almost the same amount of time, 40 years. He passed away a few years ago. And the Ageless Wisdom Teaching is really about the evolution of consciousness, the growth of consciousness. So that's in my genes, really, as a researcher as well. And the interesting thing is how I got involved or interested in the contactees and the flying saucer phenomenon was when I discovered that George Adamski's first booklet was called Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. The Ageless Wisdom Teaching originate from what are known as Masters of Wisdom, and they are the individuals that make up the kingdom that has evolved out of the human kingdom. And they are not masters in any authoritarian way, but masters over their lower selves, over the laws of physics, the laws of nature. And they identify with, from our point of view, to a point of perfection, with their real selves, with their higher selves, with what is in essence, our divinity, which is in each and every one of us. But the more you identify with it, the more you're able to demonstrate it and put it in practice and live by it. So that's where my interest in Adamski and other contactees started.
Okay, so if you were to define, like we know today, the vast majority of science is materialistic, sort of like Sunday school belief things, where they have a very firm worldview, which differs from the ancient wisdom. What would be the sort of the key points that would be different in these two worldviews?
Well, actually, it's interesting because, you know, especially of late, there's almost an avalanche of publications from scientists who say there is no such divide. The divide exists in the minds of rather fundamentalist scientists whose approach is now called scientism, another ism, and there's networks of scientists now who say that quantum physics, starting with quantum physics, quantum theory, these disciplines show that science cannot do without spirituality. Spirituality is about the growth of consciousness, expansion of consciousness, and consciousness is now shown is quite separate from matter. It doesn't originate from matter, from chemical processes in the brain. It is quite its own element in reality, and mainstream scientism is not able to explain the origins of consciousness on its own terms. So without real science cannot deny spirituality in order to aspire to a better understanding, more complete understanding of reality, of the universe, of life, etc., etc.
Okay, so would ancient wisdom say that consciousness is primary, like the sort of the Eastern mystic teachings, where it's all comes from consciousness and it evolves into matter, and there's densities, and I think you were talking about oneness, this idea that everything is one. So the quantum physics is sort of starting to bring up these ideas, which I think were around long before they got there. And that may be what you're talking about, where people are now starting to write papers that say, no, these people may have been right all along.
Yes, exactly. There's a very interesting book by Professor Erwin Laszlo, a Hungarian professor. You may have heard of him.
Yes, yes.
And that's exactly what he says. Consciousness is at the basis of the manifestation of matter. There's consciousness first, and matter follows from that, emerges from that. If scientists look at the smallest particles of what matter is made up of, they cannot find anything tangible. So it's clusters of vibration in organized clusters that make up the forms around us, including our bodies, including the planets. So there's this sea of consciousness. Adamski, in what is really his first book, The Invisible Ocean, calls it a sea of consciousness, where in the different strata, the different appearances, physical manifestations emerge at different levels of density. So at the bottom of the ocean, so to speak, to use that metaphor, the forms are coarse and slow because the pressure is high. But as you come nearer the surface, the clusters are more vibrant, more light, and more lively because the pressure is lower. So there's an infinite number of gradations in terms of consciousness and how it manifests. And apparently, when we look around the solar system, our planet is the place where consciousness has involved itself to the densest plane of matter, because we do not find people walking around on other planets, but it is increasingly likely and plausible that other planets are inhabited, including planets in our own solar system, except the um, the manifestation of life on those planets has not descended to the same level of density as it has on Earth.
Okay. Now, I think we're going to talk about Adamski, who, for people who don't know, was, I think, the first contactee, correct, 1952, about maybe a couple days after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. Him and Williamson suddenly came forward and said, we've had this contact. And he was very much ridiculed as stealing the stuff from Blavatsky and just grabbing this sort
Yeah.
of weird teachings and incorporating it into UFO story. And before you and I got on, I was referring to a lecture you had given where you referenced this stunning thing that I saw where Adamski describes inside the craft, the light inside the craft, which is identical to what experiencers today who are taken by grays and all these other different types of stories that they tell. It's exactly the same story. So can you talk a little bit about Adamski and the trials he went through and how, from what you found, there may be some vindication for him as well as the fact that he was actually on the mark in terms of what he was saying?
Yes, absolutely. He was not, in fact, the first contactee, apparently, in terms of when the first reported contact happened, but he was the first to come out with his
Okay.
experience and speak and write publicly about his experience. And that said, I personally believe, based on his earlier teachings and what he intimated in private correspondence, that he had earlier contacts, even going back to his childhood, that he was not supposed to talk about earlier in his life and during his mission. But indeed, Adamski, of course, is a iconic name in the field of extraterrestrial contact and flying saucers. And he's at the same time he's the most vilified and the most ridiculed. He has been under attack from almost day one when his experiences became public. And he in his first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was co-authored in part by the Irish aristocrat Desmond Leslie, who made a study also based on the Ageless Wisdom Teaching of ancient extraterrestrial visitations through the centuries, throughout human history, recorded history. And the description, Adamski's description of his experience in the desert in 1952, November 1952, was appended to Desmond Leslie's book, and it was combined as and published as Flying Saucers Have Landed in 1953. And Adamski was the first to have rather convincing photographs, and his photos from his experience in 1952 have last year or 2 years ago were enhanced by a Danish photographer, René Erik Olsen, and he has them on his website. And it's very interesting to see details of the craft over the hilltops, where Adamski went to meet a being who stepped out of the flying saucer. And from a distance, the whole scene was witnessed by five or six of his co-workers, friends, among whom George Williamson and a few co-workers. And from then on, the four of the six witnesses took the story a few days later to the Phoenix Gazette. They published it, and the headline in the very first report about Adamski's experience, contact experience, referred to the concerns of the visitors about our playing with the A-bomb, the atom bomb. Even in the very first newspaper report. And when was it? 2010, I believe, when Robert Hastings came out with his UFO and nukes hearing in the Washington Press Club, giving space room for I believe 7 former military officials in the United States military who had exactly those experiences of UFOs appearing over nuclear missile bases, shutting them down, not destroying anything, just shutting them down, still showing all these years after Adamski's first experience their concern with our nuclear madness. And of course, those concerns are much more, even more urgent now that I believe that some 24 nations are in possession of nuclear power and nuclear capability. And the competition for scarcer resources is only increasing. So it just shows how topical and on point Adamski's contact was.
Yeah. So at that time, and you can maybe clarify, were there were contactees around the world as well? It wasn't just Adamski; they were in Europe and South America and stuff. Did they all have basically the same message and the same sort of stories about what was going on?
Yeah, well, the way I do my research is I don't look for differences in accounts. I look for the similarities.
Right.
The
Right.
differences are usually about details that have not much to do with the essence of the experience or the message indeed. And when you do that, you see a striking similarity in experiences and messages. Among people in the United States. Of course, the United States had apparently the most contactees, at least the most who came out with their experiences and went public, wrote about it, had lectures and went to UFO conventions, etc., especially in the 1950s. But the same thing, same things, the same experiences were going on in Europe, in South America, in China, apparently around the world. And the message is always the same when you use a few criteria. I've defined a few criteria in one of my books, historical, social, political, and spiritual. And if you look at those things, it's makes it easier to sort of distinguish between fantasy and most likely real experiences. And the message is always the same. The world needs to unite. We need to overcome our divisions. We need to realize, grow in consciousness that we are one planet, that we depend on the same planet, that we depend on each other to survive the current crisis. If we look at how modern transportation, communication, information technologies have changed our experience of the physical world to that of an interconnected global community, and we see that our structures, political, financial, economic, and all those things, are still based on the old worldview of competition for power and money and territory, etc. That's where the crisis in consciousness is that makes this time in human history so dangerous. And that is why there's such a enormous increase in instances of extraterrestrial visitations. They are here in order to support, inspire us to make that step in consciousness and to grow out of the ideas of America first or India first or China first. No, it's humanity first. And unless we see that and act on it, we will destroy ourselves. And that warning has been given, through all contactees.
And in terms of now we have the virus, I sort of call it the oneness virus, where it's sort of saying that whether you're rich or poor or whatever, we're all connected, and you better figure this out. That you can't build walls to keep this out. That in it's almost like a message or like a collective consciousness that sort of manifested this thing because we were so divided and so me versus you. And I know with the experience, I do a lot with experiencers, and the number one message according to the Edgar Mitchell survey is people are talked to 54% by the beings about oneness and love, and this other message you're talking about with the weapons that and the ecology and stuff like that.
Well, yes, it's fascinating because since the 1960s we've been warned by scientists that this economic policy, this dream of continuous economic growth and focus on the growth of gross national product is eating up the planet, and we've been plundering the planet. It's a danger to the climate. We've had acid rain in the 1970s and 80s. We had extreme weather conditions. We had global warming. Then we had now we have climate change um, and melting polar caps, ice caps. Um, we have plundered and pillaged the planet to a degree that, to me, it feels like it's sort of, like when you have a fever, your body starts to fight it off. This is, to me, the coronavirus is like the planet fighting off this virus of the sickness, the illness of division. We cannot, because the plundering of the planet, the natural resources, the pollution that's going on, the overconsumption, we cannot continue that without destroying our own habitat. So and the oneness that we're talking about is not just humanity being one and harmony and peace and la la la. No, it's a oneness of interconnection. The planet is a living being. Humanity is only one unit in that living being, just as we have organs in our body. The planet has various organs, we might say. We have the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, human kingdom. We have the spiritual kingdom, mineral kingdom, and they all need to be in balance, and they all have their purpose. And we cannot just continue to exploit the other kingdoms for our own profit. That goes nowhere except in the bank accounts of decreasing number of people. So to me, it really, when it started to become global, it felt like, and the one country after another started to go into lockdown, and international travel was suspended. It really felt like the planet was giving us a message. You really have to start listening now, or else we'll all go down.
Yeah, it was actually said by the great physicist David Bohm. It is as if a swarm of locusts had descended upon the earth, and is this consumption thing. So how do you answer people? Because you'll hear in the UFO community, you'll hear this thing like it's a hive mentality, that the aliens are all sort of working for the one. There's no rich guys, and there's no individuality and stuff. So how do you answer people who say, no, we need individuality, we need capitalism, I want to have feed my kids and have 2 cars and a house and stuff like that? It seems to be a big thing that we're up against, trying to almost like pushing a rock up a hill in terms of the message. I think that does seem to be very clear, that unless you get your act together and realize that Gaia is first and the individual is second, you're just going to destroy the place. In fact, I worked in Canada, because I'm from Canada, you're in Europe, and I worked on the Canadian government in the early 1950s. Wilbert Smith ran the program here, and he was in contact with an alien by the name of Alpha, and his message was exactly the same as Adamski, and there was actually some correspondence between him and Adamski and a lot of the other contactees. And he basically said that he was told that except for a nuclear exchange, they will not step in and do anything. Until then, they are going to allow the human race to stew in its own juices. This idea that we have to learn our lessons. So how do you respond to this? It's almost like a real sort of Western idea of capitalism, of consumerism. When they say, okay, you're just preaching socialism, you're just trying to take away our rights. How do you answer that kind of objection?
Yeah. Adamski was accused of preaching socialism, and that was the reason why he was under FBI scrutiny for a long time, since his first contacts. I think the misunderstanding is based on a confusion between two very distinct concepts. People who oppose the idea of working together globally to solve global problems, like you said earlier, we cannot build walls to keep out climate change or viruses or whatever. Oneness, unity, is quite a different thing. Working together, cooperating on a global scale to solve global problems is quite a different thing from uniformity. You cannot have unity when we all think and do the same, because then there is nothing to become one. Uniformity is about, fascism, Nazism. Everybody needs to think the same. We all need to walk the line, and if you don't, then we'll lock you up or we'll destroy you. That's uniformity. Uniformity, actually, commercialization. McDonald's all over the world, or KFC, or whichever brand all over the world. That's uniformity. That has nothing to do with freedom of choice. It has nothing to do with individuality. If we all dress the same because one fashion brand is popular at one time, and 2 years later another brand is popular, and we all wear baggy trousers or whatever the fad of the day may be, that is uniformity. Unity is quite different. Unity comes from the greatest amount of diversity. If you look at nature, diversity is the natural order, and so it should be. We have different colors, we have different backgrounds, we have different beliefs, we have different approaches to life, and only by bringing the richness of that diversity together can we work towards unity and bring the natural order of diversity to the fullest potential and the most beautiful manifestation of oneness. Oneness without diversity is not oneness. That's just, that's like, that's dead. There's nothing to be celebrated there. And it needs the unity needs the richness of diversity, the greatest possible diversity, where uniformity goes against the natural order. There's nothing in nature that is uniform. We see laws of nature, we see um, correlations, we see patterns that are very similar, but always in different colors or different gradations or different dimensions or relations. So it is the greatest diversity that will allow us to unite for the greater good. And unless we see that, of course, we will have more and more of this free market economy, digging up the soil, polluting the air, and um, making people unhealthy on all kinds of levels, only for the profit of the big corporations. And that is freedom. It's a lack of ability to think critically and independently, I think, when people level the accusation of against unity, because they are afraid of uniformity. We have to distinguish between the two.
You made the analogy of the body, which I think I've used it a few times as well. The idea that all the cells of the body know what they're supposed to do, and they do exactly what they're supposed to do. And when you get a cell that decides it's not going to do what it's supposed to do, and it's just going to keep dividing, and it's going to do whatever it wants, that's called a cancer cell. And that there's an analogy. I think Adamski, I think you brought it up in some of your writings and stuff, is the idea that it's not just the Earth, it's the whole universe works that way, that it's all, the Earth is part of a bigger system. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, the Earth, of course, is just as the different kingdoms in nature are essential parts of a planet and expression and manifestation of the life stream on a planet. So the planets are themselves different manifestations in a greater body called the solar system, where um, we might say that, especially from seen from the Ageless Wisdom Teaching, a human being is directed by the soul, is ensouled, informed by the soul, the divine spark, whatever you want to call it, the higher self, um, and is a manifestation of that. And what we see in the mirror is merely the mask that the higher self uses to express and experience life. So the solar system is directed and sold by what we see on the physical plane as the sun. And so it goes on. The solar system is only one part of a greater being, a galaxy. Our solar system doesn't seem to be very significant in the greater scheme of things, and scientists have found massive, incredibly large clusters and structures, and these are all, of course, only what we see or as physical manifestations. What we don't see are the subtle physical, the etheric physical blueprints from which these physical manifestations precipitate, and even more the spiritual forces that set all these clusters of manifestation into uh, into movement, into process, and um, it there's so much that we don't know. Quantum physics, quantum theory, system science is only now beginning to see and recognize that the oneness of not only life on Earth, but the fact that the smallest quanta, the smallest clusters, are just as conscious as the largest ones that we can see. So, a little modesty would behoove us, um, and curiosity, less certainty about, well, this is matter and we can do with it what we want because we have a brain, whereas the brain again is only an instrument for the mind, which is the intermediary between consciousness and the physical plane. So there's so much we don't know, and the interesting thing, I think, is that much of what the contactees were taught and were speaking about and writing, and especially George Adamski, he was, as for me, he's the bravest of all of them. um, is very much along the same lines. It's not about flying saucers and propulsion. Of course, how they manage to transport themselves between planets, that's fascinating, and that could be really helpful. But I saw a quote of yours the other day, that the operation of the vehicles, the interplanetary vehicles, is to do with consciousness. And they it's like a control via the mind, and an interface between physical and consciousness. Um, and I'm not a very technical person, but you can only do that when your mind is attuned enough to that oneness that comes from an identification with a higher consciousness, with, striving towards greater growth of consciousness, that would allow us to do that. So even if the extraterrestrials would give us the specs for their vehicles, we may be able to build things that are now part perhaps of a space program that governments are not talking about, but we would not be able to fly them to other planets.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I've talked to some people that the fact that they do have the hardware, but they can't turn it on. It's like, because it involves this consciousness link, which you don't
Exactly.
have. So as long as they're talking physical nuts and bolts and technology, they don't understand what's going on. So you always hear these stories that they've got this, they got that, and I'm going, no, just simple, the fact that you fly it with the mind, we don't have that. In terms
No.
of you're talking about everything being conscious, I think, which is a prime. It's just starting to come out in quantum physics, and it's been in wisdom teachings that everything is conscious. And did you talk? I guess you talked as well about Rupert Sheldrake, the fact that things are following patterns. It's not a random world. It's things are building on patterns, more elaborate patterns, but it's basically the same pattern whether you're at a micro level or at a galaxy level.
Yes, well, I've referred to Rupert Sheldrake's work as an example, in my view, of where science needs to look for life on the other planets, the etheric planes of matter. If just mainstream science admits that it cannot pinpoint 90% of what their calculations say is the mass of the universe. 90% of that is missing according to their own calculations.
Yeah.
That means we're not seeing quite a lot. And just as there are sound frequencies of sound and light that escape our physical hearing and sight, apparently there are planes of matter, and the Ageless Wisdom Teaching tells us that there are 4 planes of matter above the 3 that we know: dense physical, liquid physical, and gaseous physical.
Yeah.
And in the wisdom teachings, they are referred to as etheric planes of matter, and it's nothing to do with spirits or ghosts or anything. They're just planes of matter, each at where the subatomic particles vibrate at higher frequencies than at the plane below it. And Rupert Sheldrake's work, I think, but also Semyon Kurlian's work, the Kurlian photography,
Yeah.
and who was the other one? Oh, Wilhelm Reich, the guy
Orgone energy, yeah.
who discovered orgone radiation. They were all looking at what they saw, what they discovered, what they were experimenting with. To my mind, are the first forays into discovering the etheric planes of matter. And again, that's only still matter. That's not consciousness yet. It's where life on the other planets, I think, may be found. That's how flying saucers, for instance, may just drop into our vision in a split second, just because they are able to, let's say, flick a switch and lower the vibratory rate of the particles, the atoms that compose their bodies and their craft, into to a vibratory rate that falls into our range of vision,
Yeah.
or the other way around.
Yeah, there's actually a story told, Wilbert Smith. It was told to me by Walt Andrews, who used to run the big MUFON group in the world. He was the head. He told me a story that he claimed Wilbur had told him, and that and Wilbur ran the Canadian government flying saucer program from 1950 to 54. That he had been in a field and the craft had landed, and then the craft disappeared, and he thought it was gone. And they said, take a stone and throw it. And he throws a stone and it hits the craft. And they described it as able to bend light around themselves, that we sort of assume that they're here or they're not here, and they could be around us all the time, and it's just a matter of perception that you just can't see them.
Exactly that. And again, that is exactly what most of the contactees have been told and shown. So I know when there's so many similarities in their stories, I think they should be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And we need to look for explanations rather than ridicule them or ask them for proof. Show us some piece of metal or
Yeah.
whatever, because that's nuts and bolts and the wrong end of the stick.
Yeah, yeah. You can have all the cell phones you want in the 17th century. It's not going to help you until you understand the rest of it. In terms of one thing I've always sort of wondered about, and I'd like to get your opinion on, is the contactees of the 1950s. Oh, they're all like human type beings, and then we have almost like in 1961 we have sort of a flip to Greys with Betty and Barney Hill, and then suddenly along come the reptilians, and then along come the sort of the mantis beings. Have you ever thought about the pattern why we have this sort of is it a pattern of disclosure by the beings, or do you believe that they are able to flip from one type of say a screen image or whatever to another? Are they actual physical beings in terms of your understanding? And why is there this difference between, like, there was no Greys before 1961, there was no sort of even aliens before 1947, and it's almost like they sort of appear and it's some sort of, it looks like to me like some sort of pattern that they're unfolding in front of us.
You forgot the blue avians.
Blue avians. I tell you an interesting story. It's almost like you can at times you can maybe sort of manifest this stuff, because I thought it was the craziest story in the world. And then I was in Denmark and I was talking to a girl, and she was channeling Martin Luther's wife and the blue avians. I said, the blue avians? Are you and it's almost like maybe we created in a field by thinking about it, and she's able to go in the field and pick it up, because that just sort of shocked me with this. And you can see like just these various types. And I talked to the guy who had the biggest catalog of humanoid sightings. He had 20,000. And I said, well, how many separate types of beings do you think there are? And he said, I didn't count, but it's got to be way over 1,000. And then when you look at the Greys, you get people who draw the Greys. I did a whole scenario of them, maybe 20 of them, and I put them on a PowerPoint. I put the first one, second one on top of the third one, fourth one, and you look and they're all different. You know, some have ridges, and then they're saying all these different races or whatever. But that's always sort of disturbing. I'd like to get your opinion as to why these different types of races, are they doing different things, or could this all be the same thing?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you, as you point out, you know, we didn't have grays before the 1960s,
Yeah.
and just to expand on that, we didn't have abductions before the Barney and Betty Hill case.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember. Just put a point in there. I remember I was talking to Betty Hill, and what I had heard was that when she first reported to Nightcap, she was talking to Keyhoe, he would have nothing to do with it. He said, "Get out of here." I mean, they don't abduct people off the street, and it was just total rejection of her whole story. And later on, it got accepted, and it's become the main story now. But yeah, you're right. There was no before 1960, even though people try to write it into early history.
Yeah, and I think that should give us pause to think. Why were there no abductions before 1960?
Yeah.
See, Adamski, Bethlehem, Fry, Angelucci, and all the other contactees from the 1950s. I refer to them as the original contactees in South America, in Italy, the famous friendship case. They were all warned about our nuclear capability, especially in the midst of the Cold War. You know, the Soviets against the Western Bloc. And it's interesting also how the Western Bloc, led by America, was championing freedom, and the Eastern Bloc was championing justice.
Yeah.
And in fact, they can't. Those are two concepts that cannot go without each other. You know, that you cannot have freedom without justice, and you cannot have justice without freedom. Because of the Cold War, the governments depended on the public's consent for the massive public spending on weapons and the whole nuclear arsenal and conventional weapons. When these contactees were drawing more and more public interest in their message of international cooperation to overcome our divisions rather than emphasize the divisions, the governments, I feel, became worried and began to inform the field with misinformation first. First, of course, we had the cover-ups with the crashes, Roswell, and the bodies, etc. And then because the message from the contactees raising people's hope for a better world became too popular, the misinformation was fed into the field, and that eventually led to abductions, stories of abductions, cattle mutilations, and all kinds of atrocities that categorically, I believe, have nothing to do with the extraterrestrial visitors. Yes, there are planets, just as each human being differs from the other in terms of where they stand on the path of evolution, how much they've grown in conscious awareness. That's why we have a difference between the difference in awareness and identification between, say, a simple peasant and Leonardo da Vinci or a Buddha or Christ or whoever. We're all on the same path, but we're not all in the same on the same place, on the same level. The same goes for planets. Earth is at a midway point given the grand scale of the solar system. And there are planets in the solar system that are not as far advanced, evolved as planet Earth. They have a humanity there, and some of these have the ability to travel between planets, just because they live from a sense and an awareness of oneness. They've not lost that sense like we have on this planet. And the stories, the atrocities that are attributed to extraterrestrial visitors, um, I think are based on deliberate disinformation, because the planet beings from planets that are not so evolved in the solar system, our solar system, are simply not. In the past, they visited here and they did their own thing for their own benefit, because this is such a crucial time in our history. There are three people, Wilbert Smith among them, Benjamin Crane, the British esotericist, Michael Wolff, the American scientist who worked alongside extraterrestrial scientists. They've all said that there's a ring of protection around this planet that was put into place, I believe, somewhere in the 1950s, to keep negative influences from within the solar system out. So abductions are simply not attributed, cannot be attributed to people from other planets. Now, your question about the appearance, the greys and the reptilians, etc. The human form, based on what the contactees, I mean, let me be clear, I do not claim to have any experience myself.
Okay.
And if I had, then I'm not aware of it. Maybe it was blocked out, I don't know. I've just researched the contactees' stories, and I try to find corroboration in science, mainstream science, advanced, the more avant-garde science, the wisdom teachings, religions, etc., to form a complete picture. And based on the stories of the original contactees, they all say that the human form is a universal occurrence, not only in the solar system, throughout cosmos.
Yeah.
Of course, just as on our planet, some people don't grow much over 3 feet or 4 feet,
Yeah.
and some African races, and other people are really tall now. We have found, or apparently they have found, skeletons of people who were maybe like 9 feet tall. So there's huge differences even within our own Earth humanity. Different colors, different facial traits, characteristics, etc. And so it is, again, because of diversity. It is around the same, goes around the solar system, and every planet has its own different type of humanity that contributes in its own way to the life of their planet, and through that to the solar system as a whole. And I think a lot of what people claim to be the appearance of the beings that they've contacted, a lot may be informed by thought forms that have built up over the decades through misinformation and just plain fantasy. And because it makes for interesting stories, and for some people it makes for attention, and maybe it will provide them a platform for their stories. I think there's a large diversity, variety in forms. How the human form may look, but it's always based on the trunk and limbs and a head, etc. And it seems some people from other planets might look really scary to us if we would see them in their own form. The more advanced humanities from other planets are able to adjust that, so that we will not be taken aback when we see them and when they need us to see them. Yeah, I think reptilians and praying mantis types and all that kind of thing, blue avian. I mean, I looked on the internet. When did the blue avians first come up? It was not long after the movie Avatar had premiered. So
Yeah. Yeah, and the
there's
reptilians have only been around since 1988. That's what I noticed too. And people, because you've been in a long time, I have, but what I find, and you correct me if I'm wrong, people just sort of gloss over this stuff. They don't really see the pattern and say, well, this is kind of strange. Like Betty and Barney Hill's aliens were wearing hats, and everybody just sort of ignores that. It's like, oh, well, they had hats, okay, And so you went. How many experiences have you worked on? And can you talk about, because the idea I think in the general public is that they were just these crazy guys in the 1950s, and then they sort of got exposed and they went away. But I think you've talked about some in the 1980s from South America. And are there some around today, like people that you're dealing with that are live, that you're actually like a one-on-one correspondence with?
No, no one that I'm in correspondence with. But to pick up on the point that or the thing you were saying about the crazy guys from the 50s, the really fascinating thing is that late 2018, I discovered and managed to obtain a copy of George Adamski's very first booklet, The Invisible Ocean, and that is almost one-on-one similar to what system science and quantum theory are telling us now, that we live in an ocean of consciousness. Everything that we see in physical manifestation exists as a result of a conscious principle behind it. And that tells me Adamski wasn't crazy. Adamski knew better what he was talking about than almost anybody else in the field. And well, when we come to his experiences with extraterrestrial visitors, the space people, the space brothers as he called them, a very interesting case that came up in Italy in the 1950s, the friendship case, the Amicizia case, tells of space people living and working in underground bases around Italy, not only Italy, around Europe and even other parts of the world. And again, they had exactly the same message and the same urgent message to humanity, come together, make sure that you overcome your differences and your divisions in order to work together for the greater good. The same goes for contacts in South America. There's another interesting case from Italy, 1980, Giorgio Di Bitonto. And the interesting thing in his case was that once he started meeting the extraterrestrials who contacted him, at one point he was introduced to the same extraterrestrials that Adamski described and named as Kalna and Orton and some of the others, and they confirmed that they were the same people, and they even introduced him to a person who was keeping quiet, and he said he lived among you, and when he lived on Earth he was known as George, and it was very clear from his account that he was being introduced to George Adamski in his Venusian uh, um, body of manifestation. So yeah, these things. And what is important again, to come back to that point of all the misinformation and disinformation that have polluted the whole arena and field of ufology since the mid 1950s. We have to wonder why there's such a increase in cases of sightings and experiences, contact experiences, starting in the late 40s, 50s, not just in the States but worldwide, at this really tense time in human history. It is, again, according to the wisdom teachings, the time where humanity has to take the next step in consciousness. We have to realize that we are one humanity. We don't have to be the same. We shouldn't think the same. We shouldn't be wearing the same clothes. But we need to realize and recognize and act on the realization that we are one, in order to restore the planet to health and to prevent destroying ourselves. In order to do that, because if you look at the world at this time, with all the authoritarian leaders that have promised a solution to the people in the United States, in Brazil, in Hungary, and other countries, you might think, well, this is never going to work. Humanity is not ready to take such a step. But then we need to realize that it was only since the late 19th century that we were reintroduced to the idea of consciousness and the growth of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, to the idea of a spiritual kingdom in nature that has evolved out of the human kingdom. The spiritual hierarchy, so to speak, of masters of wisdom. And that started in the late 19th century in preparation for their return to open public work with humanity. These were the philosopher kings in Atlantis who gave the great civilizations to the people then, until the people started misusing the powers they were given, and they withdrew themselves. Now they are returning to public view in order to inspire humanity to make the right choice. Adamski literally said, we've come to the final crossroads. This is the same thing that is been presented in the wisdom teachings through Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and Benjamin Creme. And Benjamin Creme said that the master of all the masters, the world teacher, has been in the world in a physical body, indestructible, since 1977, and he will be with us, with humanity, for the duration of the coming 2000 years, roughly. The age of Aquarius. The past age was the age of Pisces, inaugurated through Jesus 2000 years ago, which gave us the qualities of individuality and idealism, which we're now struggling with their extremes. And the keynotes for the new age are synthesis and oneness. So with the individuality that we should cherish and we should develop, rather than all buy the same stuff to look the same and listen to the same and watch the same, um, develop our individual talents and insights to be able to contribute those to our communities, to the world community. And in order to help humanity make the right choice, continue on the current path of competition and of eventual annihilation, or take the path towards cooperation and sharing and peace, because justice through sharing is the only way to peace. And we can only make that choice from a realization that freedom starts with freedom from want, freedom from fear. That's where that's the essence of freedom, that you don't have to be afraid, where does my next meal come from, will I be able to pay the hospital bill? That's the essence of freedom. Then you can be free to make different choices, other choices. What do I want to do? How do I want to develop my talents? How will I raise my kids to be the best persons, the best human beings they can be, in order to help humanity make that choice? The a large number of masters of wisdom, including the master of all the masters, are returning to the world now, and they have been returning since 1975. And the space brothers, the masters, are our elder brothers. They've evolved out of the human kingdom. They were men and women like we are, but they've gone ahead of us on the path of evolution, and that's why they are our elder brothers. And they are um, helped and assisted by the elder brothers from space, the space brothers. And that is really the significance of this time.
Wow. Yeah, I noticed you talked fear, which I think is a big thing now. The sort of the preaching of fear, live in the future, try to sort of like instill people so that they're not controlled, but it's something that's seems to have taken over our society. This idea that and you'll see a lot of it in terms of people lecturing. The ones that have the fear message actually get the bigger audiences. The people seem to feed on fear, and it's
Yes,
sort of hard to
people
get
can
the
be
opposite message
manipulated.
across. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's it, and that's the danger, of course. And you would almost say the beauty of this Corona situation. And I don't want to take away anything of the suffering,
Yeah.
of
I,
people who are, in ICUs and need assistance with breathing, etc. That's horrible.
yeah.
But the fact that the world is forced to come to a standstill, and allowing many more people than before to reflect and introspect, uh, I'm hoping that will help people to think about what they really need, what's really important in life, and become a bit more critical and independent in their thinking, and less easily manipulated.
You referred to the fact that they were getting message. Have you seen any sort of messages where people were, any of the contactees that predicted what we're looking at right now in terms of what they were being told? Because you always hear, like, I know with the free survey or the Edgar Mitchell survey, 39% of people claim when they're on the ship they were shown the screen, and the screen shows the environmental devastation or floods or nuclear war, stuff like this. So did you see anything in what you've written about Adamski that would show that they actually were sort of predicting this coming along? Like, well, I mentioned Wilbert Smith said, we'll just allow the human race to stew in its own juices, that we can't really, we just let them do whatever they want and pick up the pieces there, or that they are here to save the planet and they're not necessarily here to save the people.
Yes, that's what I've found in the accounts of the what I call the genuine contactees. We have freedom of choice.
Yeah.
If we want to destroy ourselves, then the space people are not going to stop us.
Yeah.
If we would, collectively press all the nuclear buttons and blow up the planet, that would directly impact the solar system, and they would stop us from doing that, no doubt. Um, but we have freedom of choice, and we will be inspired by, the space people have been trying through individual contacts, especially when, because you're more aware, you know more about that than anyone else, I think, with your presidential UFO files. They have been informing all the world governments in the 1950s of their presence and their reality, and it was like a collective decision not to make it public. So they continued with individual contacts, and that is still going on. And they help people, they heal people, they help scientists. There's so much going on that we know nothing about. Benjamin Krem has said that, and that's in corroboration of George Adamski's statements, and Alberto Perego, the Italian diplomat who was part of the friendship case, and who was also a co-worker of Adamski. According to Benjamin Graham, about 90 or 99% of the space people's time goes into cleaning up the atmosphere, neutralizing all the toxins, and especially the nuclear radiation that is released through our nuclear power plants and nuclear tests and what have you. Because if they hadn't been doing that for the last, since the maybe since 1945 with the first explosions, this planet would have been inhabitable already. So they are really at our service, and they're trying their utmost to keep this planet intact and keep it habitable within reason. Of course, again, we have freedom of choice, and it's up to us to take the cue and listen to the messages that we have been given, the warnings, and Benjamin Graham. If I don't know how long we have, but Benjamin Graham has said that in order to help humanity make the right decision, the world teacher, he has been planning his public declaration on a worldwide scale, um, during which time, for about 20 minutes, he will enter into a telepathic contact with every single human being on the planet above the age of 14, give his message of, of the spiritual heights from which we have descended, the fact, and give us an experience of the divinity that we are really an manifestation of and a reflection of, and that we can still aspire to, and that we can grow to if we expand our consciousness, and work together, if we can avoid our own destruction. And that will be accompanied by an outflow of the energy of love, which is really basic to the physical manifestation of the universe, maybe even the spiritual manifestation of the universe, because the glue between the particles that make up an atom or the planets in a solar system or the various solar systems in a galaxy, that is a physical manifestation of the same energy that we call love, that keeps families together and communities. So the energy of love that the world teacher embodies on this planet will stream out during that time, during his public declaration, um, directly into the hearts of humanity. And Benjamin Graham has explained that um, about 1/3 of the people will respond immediately. They are ready for this message and they are ready to move forward. 1/3, everybody of course will be moved to tears, but some people will be afraid, and they will be afraid to lose everything they hold dear and think is important, because not everybody is at the same point. And another third will be watching from the side, will be undecided, etc. But recent research has shown that it takes only about, what is it, 1.8 or 3.5% of the population to make fundamental changes to society. And if the world teacher has 1/3 people ready to act on this unbelievable outflow of the energy of love, that we will all recognize in ourselves, and 1/3 of the humanity of 7.5 billion people respond to that, I think we will see changes that we think impossible now. So I've been very, very hopeful despite all the appearances to the contrary.
Yeah. Well, good. I just have one thing what you just talked about the cleanup. It's kind of weird you're talking about the cleanup, because Wilbert Smith had that as well. There was the two aliens. One was the alien of Alpha, and Tyla was the one that did the cleanup. They called him the garbage man, and he would run around. And it's weird how you would bring it up here, because I've never really told anybody that story. Wilbur Smith's wife told me that story about Tyla being the cleanup guy. Can we go now to your book? Finally, can we deal with your latest book? And can you give me the premise of your book, the Sea of Consciousness?
The Sea of Consciousness, yes. The Sea of Consciousness is actually, it came about when I came across this first book by Adamski, The Invisible Ocean, and I read it, and I thought, and at the same time I was reading the book by Professor Laszlo, The Intelligence of the Cosmos, and the similarity of the information was striking. And this was this was 1932. This was before his book, The Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. He was talking about quantum theory, in his own very simple terms, but so accessible and so direct and heartfelt, and so comprehensible. So it's so immediate and easy to understand. Um, and reading this book by Ervin Laszlo and another book, What is Reality, with the latest insights from system science and quantum theory, I thought, how am I going to present this volume, the Invisible Ocean by Adamski, so that people will see that he was way ahead of his time, even before he wrote about contacts from space. And gradually the idea evolved that I would publish his book verbatim and write a chapter um, to um, to how to say that, to illuminate, to explain the similarity with the system science and quantum theory. Well, in fact, it evolved into 3 chapters. The first chapter that I wrote, where science vindicates Adamski's teaching, um, I make the almost, well, I put Adamski's quotes from Adamski's first book, The Invisible Ocean, next to quotes from Professor Laszlo, um, and show how important that is, and how consistent it is with his later messages from the space people, and when he sort of returned to his early teachings from the time in Laguna Beach with his Royal Order of Tibet. And there's another chapter where I show how a lot of the criticism, almost all of the criticism of Adamski, is based on deliberate misinterpretations or just misunderstandings. and a malice, in fact. And in the final chapter, I actually wrote that um, before I came across the invisible ocean, and it's titled "Can Astrophysics See Beyond Its Own Limitations?" And there I explain, based on what we discussed, the fact that mainstream science cannot account for 90% of the mass of the universe, based on the avant-garde experiments of Reich and Curlian and Sheldrake, that there is a lot to be said for the notion from the wisdom teachings of planes of matter above the gaseous, the etheric planes of matter, and um, using examples or quotations from the accounts of the contactees that sort of bring all these things together. So that is really, it's not a very thick book, about 100 pages, but I think it is really fundamental to a proper understanding of the UFO phenomenon.
And that's on all your books are on Amazon. You got 5 books on Amazon.
Yes, they're all available on Amazon, and they're all translated. I've translated them myself into Dutch, and someone else has translated them in French, and the 2 of them are in Spanish, and 3 of them are in Japanese. So they can be found all around the world.
And what's the feedback? Are you getting good feedback that would indicate promising change in mentality?
Well, see, when you self-publish books, you don't have a huge budget to make them public, and I depend on interviews like this. I've taken myself off Facebook in 2018 when it turned out that Facebook shared its data with questionable companies like Cambridge Analytica that sold the data to influence democratic processes in the States and in the UK and other countries. Um, the feedback that I do get, I mean, they're not bestsellers. Not many people, not enough people, I think, know about my books. But the feedback that I do get is usually that people are amazed with my findings, and find it very hopeful. Up until a few years ago, I was on many internet radio interviews, and that's always, if only people hear the information, that's good enough, and if they're really interested, they can find the books. But it's about getting a proper understanding of the UFO phenomenon. It is not about the nuts and the bolts and the lights in the sky. Of course, it is to draw our attention that something is going on, but it's not about finding out exactly how they're moving around between the different planets.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's like, I call it the theory of wow, where they're trying to get your attention, or like they want you to open the door, you pin something onto a door and you open the door and then you discover what's actually going on, and it's that sort of thing. Tell me about your next book. What are you working on now in terms of and where's your thought pattern going in terms of what we need to know in the world? What's important that people need at this time?
I don't want to talk about it too much in order to avoid dispersing the energy that I need to write it. But it sort of follows from my previous books. I will take the I will tell you this. George Adamski wrote a book, 1949. It's called Pioneers of Space.
Okay.
And it's been dismissed as science fiction, and it's been used as evidence that this book, Inside the Spaceship, was based on fiction.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you read private correspondence, it shows that it's based on his out-of-body experiences.
Yeah.
And a lot of, Inside the Spaceships. I don't know, have you read the book Ami, Child of the Stars?
No, I just saw it today. I saw your lecture on. I saw
yeah.
what you're talking about there. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but it is, if you can find it, it's presented as a children's story, but it stirs the heart. So then there's a level of truth in it. And the story of Giorgio Di Bitonto, Angels in Starships, and Pioneers of Space by George Adamski from 1949. they describe that sense of oneness that we've been talking about, to such um, a real level. It makes it so real, you can almost experience it by reading that book. So I use a lot of, in my new book, I will use a lot of uh, stuff from Adamski's Pioneers of Space, and I will again bring together. I just last year, I have it here because I'm working with it. This report from the Galileo Commission,
Okay.
beyond the materialist worldview
Wow.
towards an expanded science, from a network of the scientific and medical network scientists. They talk about the importance that science takes up consciousness as its own principle. So I will be weaving all these strands from the teachings of Adamski, his teachings on consciousness. He taught much more than most other contactees. That's why, to me, he's the foremost contactee. Um, and so weaving the different strands together, from science, the wisdom teachings, the contactees, um, to build that case for the fact that, you know, we exist thanks to consciousness, as a result of consciousness, not the other way around. Consciousness is not a product of some chemical process in our minds. And I will bring in, you know, the what I found about the new technology and how that can only be useful if we have expanded our sense of who we are. There's one sentence in George Adamski's book, Inside the Spaceship, that we have to see our fellow man as a reflection of ourselves. And unless we do that, there will be no solution to any of our problems, whether it's the climate, whether it's hunger, whether it's poverty, whether it's the virus. Unless we do that, we cannot move forward. So um, uh, yes, that's the main thought that my new book will be about.
Well, I really appreciate what you're doing, because you're on the same page as I am. And
Sounds like it
one
is.
that's the consciousness being primary, all these kind of things. I mean, and I don't know how how long you've been working. I only came into this sort of realization in 2012. The primacy of consciousness and how important it was, and this oneness principle, the main message, and the concept of love and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to do whatever I can to promote what you're saying, because and I don't know if you agree, but I don't think there's that many researchers who are really working on it. Most people are still into, hey, I just got a report today about some new 9,000 new sightings or whatever, and it's like, well, who cares? I mean, we're still back in 1947 trying to prove UFOs exist. You got to get past that and figure out who are they, why are they here, and what's the main message. And I'm glad you're doing it, and I don't think there's that many people doing it. I'll do whatever I can to promote you, Gerald.
Thank you so much.
We will maybe do another one once your new book is out. We'll do a little update on it if you want, and join me again.
We'll be in touch, and yes, I'll let you know when the new book is out. I hope I'm aiming for September, October, that kind of time.
Are they in Kindle as well? Do you have Kindle versions?
No, I have one book, Before Disclosure. It has 3 essays, and that is available online as a PDF. It's available in print, but it's also available for free as PDF. People can download it from my website. Maybe it's floating around the internet. It's called Before Disclosure. What is it called? Before Disclosure, a primer for students of ufology and exopolitics.
Wow, beautiful. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time, and
thank you so much.
I'm honored to be able to interview and talk to you, and learn a lot from you, especially some of the stuff I didn't know. I thought I knew a lot about Adamski, but I just today, when I was doing some research for this, you've got a lot of stuff I didn't know about before. So I really appreciate you're bringing this out, and let's work together to elevate the world and bringing this message of oneness to people.
Sounds great. Sounds great. And thank you so much for having me. Okay. And let's keep in touch.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.